Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat. Unlike President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Fireside Chats, we're not going to be talking about current American issues, but instead going all the way back in time to England in the late 1700s, when King George III ruled over all of the land. When we get back, we're going to talk about the early life of the mad king who lost America. George III was born premature on June 4th, 1738, to Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. The sickly prince was not expected to live and was baptized on the very same day of his birth. George III was the longest ruling monarch in England before Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II. Young George was educated by private tutors, and by age 8 he could speak English and German and would soon learn to speak French. Growing up, George showed a particular interest in natural sciences, and that would continue throughout his entire life. Scottish nobleman John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute, helped the young prince overcome his shyness and advise him on many personal and political matters. When George's father died in 1751, George inherited the title of Duke of Edinburgh. 3 weeks later, the 12-year-old was named Prince of Wales by his grandfather, King George II, putting him in line to inherit the throne. When he was 18, his grandfather invited him to live at St. James' Place, but Lord Bute convinced him to stay home and live with his mother, who instilled in him her strict moral values. George III became King of Great Britain and Ireland in 1760, following his grandfather George II's death. In the speech George III gave Parliament when he took the throne of England, he said, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." During the 7 Years' War, George III was closely advised by his Prime Minister, Lord Bute, who kept the young and inexperienced monarch isolated from the key members of Parliament. George III worked for an expedited end to the 7 Years' War, taking a position that forced his influential war minister, William Pitt the Elder, to resign in 1761 because he wanted to broaden the conflict. Bute was forced to resign by members of Parliament due to strong criticism from the press and his preposterous involvement in a sex scandal involving George's mother. In 1763, George Grenville succeeded Bute as King George III's Prime Minister. Grenville looked at the American colonies as a source of revenue, which soon got King George III in trouble. Grenville argued since the colonies had benefited from the outcome of the war, and British troops were needed in America to protect them, they should pay for it. King George agreed with the reasoning and supported the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act in 1765. Now we're going to talk about King George III and the American Revolution. In 1770, Lord North became the Prime Minister, beginning a 12-year period of Parliament stability. In 1773, he passed an act taxing tea in the colonies, which resulted in the Boston Tea Party. The colonists claimed no taxation without representation, but George held firm with Lord North. The American Revolution began on April 19, 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord. Inspired by Enlightenment philosophers John Locke and Jean Rousseau, the colonists formed the Second Continental Congress and created their settlements in what they later called the Declaration of Independence. The next year, the Declaration of Independence laid out America's case for freedom, portraying George III as an inflexible tyrant who had squandered his right to govern the colonies, but in reality, the situation was much more complex. Parliament ministers, not the crown, were responsible for colonial policies, though George still had the means of direct and indirect influence. The king was reluctant to come to terms with the army's defeat at Yorktown in 1781. In the end, he deferred to Parliament's peace treaties instead of the ones he made himself. The 1783 Treaty of Paris recognized the United States and ceded Florida to Spain. The king was the exclusive target of the colonists, even though it was Parliament pulling the strings, and King George III was merely a puppet. The king continued to insist the American Revolution had to have been fought, because he would not reward disobedience. Amidst all of the political issues, King George III pushed Parliament to pass the Royal Marriages Act. A devout Anglican, the king was appalled by the behavior of his adulterous brother, Prince Henry, and the act made it illegal for a member of the royal family to marry without permission from the monarch. When we come back, we're going to talk about King George III's life after the American Revolution. George III recovered the next year and reigned for the next 12 years as a newly beloved monarch and symbol of stability in the era of France's revolutionary chaos. George supported England's role in the French Revolutionary Wars of the late 1790s and offered early resistance against the Napoleonic juggernaut. The stance King George III took with the French Revolutionary War made him, if anything, more popular than before, not supporting the Napoleonic regime. George III suffered a second major episode of insanity in 1804 and recovered, but in 1810 he slipped into his final illness, giving his son, the future King George IV, the role of Prince Regent, bringing along effective rule for the War of 1812 and Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, even though George III was still a king until his death. In 1811, personal family tragedies and the pressure of ruling caused King George's insanity to return. Feeble and blind, it was clear that the king could no longer fulfill his duties. Parliament passed the Regency Act, and ultimately, the fate of the empire fell on his eldest son, Prince George, future King George IV, who was placed in the inevitable position of having to govern according to the increasingly erratic will of his father. After this break, we'll talk about King George III's death. King George III experienced brief intervals of lucidity until his death at Windsor Castle on January 29, 1820. King George III died blind, deaf, and mad. His illness may have been caused by porphyria, an inherited metabolism disorder, although a 2005 analysis of hair samples suggested arsenic poisoning as the possible cause. King George III ruled the British Kingdom during some of the most turbulent times in history, including the loss of the American colonies. George III was England's longest ruling monarch until Queen Victoria. Modern analysis of King George III's later life also showed his sentences were much longer towards his death due from his illnesses. A sentence containing 400 words and 8 verbs was not unusual. George III, when ill, often repeated himself, and at the same time, his vocabulary became much more complex, creative, and colorful. King George III had a deep love for learning and for books. One of the most cultured monarchs, George III started a royal collection of books. There were 65,000 books, and they were all later given to the British Museum as the nucleus of their national library. In 1768, George founded and paid the initial cost of the Royal Academy of Arts. He was the first king to study science as his education. In fact, he had his own astronomical observatory when he was growing up. The planet Uranus was originally named the Georgian Star after King George of England, who had founded the 40-foot telescope William Herschel used to discover the planet. Now we're going to talk about literature during King George III's reign. The second half of the 18th century is sometimes called the Age of Johnson. Samuel Johnson, often referred to as Dr. Johnson, was an English author who made lasting contributions to English literature as a poet, essayist, moralist, literary critic, biographer, and editor of the Lexicographer. Oliver Goldsmith, who was born in 1728 and lived till 1774, settled in London in 1756, where he wrote the novel Vere of Wakefield, a pastoral poem, The Deserted Village, and 2 plays, The Good Natureman and She Stoops to Conquer. Richard Brinsley Sheridan, wrote the play The Rivals. It was an instant success. He went on to become the significant London playwright of the late 18th century. Another genre that developed during this period were the novels of manner. Frances Burney wrote Evelina, a novel that started the new genre and was admired by Jane Austen. The Graveyard Poets were a member of pre-Romantic English poets writing mainly in the 1740s, whose works characterized by their gloomy meditations on morality. The poets included Thomas Gray, William Cooper, Christian Smart, Thomas Chuterton, and many more. Also foreshadowing Romanticism was Gothic fiction, in works such as The Castle of Otranto. Gothic fiction combines elements of horror and romance. Robert Burns was a pioneer of the Romantic movement. Poems and songs by Burns that remain known around the world are Auld Lang Syne, A Red, Red Rose, To a Mouse, and E Fond Kiss. Romanticism was an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe. The publishing in 1798 of lyrical ballads is considered the beginning of the Romantic era. The writers of the Romantic period did not consider themselves as writers of such period. The Romantic period was one of major social change in England because of the development of the countryside and the rapid development of overcrowded industrial cities that took place in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Most Austen scholars believe the plays of Richard Brinsley Sheridan and Henry Fielding had a great influence on her work as well. The later parts of the 1700s saw the rise of the Age of Sensibility in England, meaning most of the literature works, like Austen's, were more a reflection of real life than previously. While Austen did not claim to use real-life influences in her work, that may be not true. In an account of the Battle of Trafalgar in the Times on November 7, 1805, there was a report of a midshipman by the name of William Prince, the same name as a character in her novel Mansfield Park. If she did in fact use real-life influence in her writing, if that this may be showing, then there may be many more cases in her writing that she used real-life influence, even though she may not say she does. The question is open interpretation, but there is a slim chance that much of Austen's work was influenced by the time period that she lived in England. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation on King George III and the literature that was written during the time of his reign.